Video cards are basically the easiest thing to understand in the world. Electricity goes in, performance happens, some heat is given off, and then the frames per second come out the other end. That's basically how a graphics card works. And we've all seen benchmarks every time there's a new generation of video cards documenting how much performance has improved, and not just for games. We're talking video encoding, mining, compute tasks of other varieties. You get the idea. Generally, they get faster and faster while using the same or less electricity, usually. And today I thought it would be worth doing a lot of power consumption benchmarks with multiple generations of NVIDIA and AMD, and we're going to see just how much electricity is being saved at things like gaming, video editing. We're looking at DirectX 9 versus 11, a whole bunch of stuff. So buckle up, because we're riding the power consumption train. It's not a very exciting train. I've tried to make these charts as easy to understand as possible. Basically, whenever there's 3 lines for each card, the yellow line represents electricity consumption, the green line represents reward, whether that's frames per second or dollars earned in mining. It's the thing you bought a GPU to get. And then at the end we have the blue bar, which is the reward divided by power consumption, and then I've scaled them all up equally just to look nice in the chart. And then all of the colors between GPUs, whenever it shows a line graph of power consumption over time, the colors stay consistent for each card, with warm colors for AMD and cool colors for NVIDIA. So jumping right in with our first test, fluid mark. Favors NVIDIA cards, but I thought it would be just a nice consistent test to start out with. So let's start with AMD, because why not? First up, Vega 64, stock settings, then Vega 64 overclocked and undervolted, and then Vega 64 kneecapped at 140 watts of power limit. Next up is the RX 470, and that finishes off AMD cards for this test. And then as we take a look at NVIDIA cards, we have 1070 Ti overclocked, then 1070 Ti regular settings, 1050 Ti so that we can see kind of a budget card, but also from the same generation. And then I have my 970 and 760, which I have modified the power limits on so that everything is locked at about 155 to 160 watt TDP, or power limit. And for those wondering just how good of a power measuring test fluid mark is, here's the power consumption. It looks pretty flat and easy to measure. Next up, we're going to take a look at Adobe Premiere rendering. First up, we have red and orange, red for Vega 64 stock and orange for Vega 64 overclocked and undervolted. And we can see that the time to render the video really doesn't change that much, but the power consumption really changes and goes down a lot. Next up, we have the RX 470, which does take a lot longer, but uses a lot less electricity at peak. Let's bring in some NVIDIA cards. Here we have the really short line, which is the 1070 Ti, rendered the video relatively quickly. And then we have the 1050 Ti, which didn't really use that much less electricity, but still took a lot longer to render. Let's bring in our GTX 970, and we can see more power consumption and slower than the 1070 Ti, so it's worse in both departments. And let's bring in the GTX 760. Oh dear, things don't look good there. And then let's look at all the cards together. We can see that the AMD cards, at least at the high end, do render faster than the 1070 Ti, which admittedly is a high mid-range card, not a 1080 Ti. But the AMD cards render it faster, using a little more power, and the NVIDIA cards, much more power efficient, but took a little bit longer to render, on average here. Next up, we have Ethereum mining. So don't get too controversial, it was just one benchmark. None of these cards are being tortured with Ethereum mining 24/7. Our stock Vega 64 using 260 watts, and it gave us some decent mining performance. Overclocking and undervolting, same power consumption, and a lot better performance. Capping it to 140 watts really brings down that amount of reward, and we actually suffer a little bit in the reward to power consumption ratio. With our 1070 Ti, it was better at mining Ethereum if electricity is your primary concern. However, because the reward is so rewarding, it is more worthwhile for the AMD cards, but it doesn't really look like it with this graph. And then our 1050 Ti, not that much worse off in terms of efficiency than our 1070 Ti, which was very different than it was for FluidMark. However, the 970, because it's really a 3.5 GB card, didn't do so well. And the 760, it's a 2 GB card, so it couldn't do it at all. Now let's take a look at folding at home. Folding at home is basically where your computer is doing cancer research, and depending on which team you join, you can actually get a monetary reward as well as, like preventing people from dying, so that's pretty good too. But how much is this going to cost you in terms of electricity? Well, if we take a look at the Vega 64 with stock settings, clearly that's going to cost you the most in terms of electricity. Overclocking and undervolting does bring that power consumption down to about 120 watts for the benchmark, and the reward ratio is a lot higher when overclocking and undervolting. And bringing down the TDP to 140 watts of course does nothing, because it's using less than 140 watts. Our RX 470 is not that much worse off in terms of efficiency at all, but folding does tend to favor NVIDIA cards. As we can see, the 1070 Ti clearly takes the cake here. The 1050 Ti is actually less efficient than Vega for this test, which is pretty interesting. And the 970 actually does better in terms of efficiency than the 1050 Ti. So I guess it really just favors some level of compute performance. And it's worth noting that this is the 4 GB 1050 Ti in case they release some weird 2.495 GB version in the future. GTX 760 didn't do too well. And finally, the part that you YouTube watchers have all been waiting for, gaming benchmarks. Pew, pew, pew. So first off, we're going to take a look at Unigine Valley in DirectX 9, 11, and OpenGL. Because if certain APIs are more power efficient for certain generations than others, I think that would be interesting, but I'm a nerd, so. First up, in DirectX 9, Vega 64, clearly a power hog, and modern NVIDIA, clearly very efficient. So take a look at the blue bars here as I change slides. We can see that with DirectX 11, that gap closes, not completely, but it does close when you move to a more modern API. With OpenGL, not much changes from DirectX 11, except that Vega does worse. Especially the power limited one to 140 watts. Rise of the Tomb Raider in DirectX 11 proved very interesting. This is on the high preset, and let me talk you through this one a little bit. Over here on the left of the two same color bars is power consumption, and then we have frames per second, but we're not talking about all that information. We want to talk about what's on this side of the charts. In red and orange, we have Vega 64, stock, underclock, overvolted, other way around, and then capped at 140 watt TDP. It has a certain level of efficiency that it tends to max out at. And then in NVIDIA, we have dark green for 1070 Ti, and then 1050 Ti in the light green, and we can see that it's about even with Vega in terms of efficiency. Maxwell is about on par with Polaris, the RX 470, and for whatever reason, this light purple graph representing the 760, it just seemed weirdly efficient, like perhaps it wasn't really running at the high preset, and we got a bunch of extra frames that we weren't supposed to. So yeah, I'm kind of doubting that the 760 is as efficient as the 1070 Ti. Doesn't seem likely. Next up, we have a bunch more detail for Rise of the Tomb Raider if you want to take a look at it. take a look at it. But I'm moving on to Far Cry 5, an AMD optimized title, unlike the NVIDIA title, Rise of the Tomb Raider. Vega 64 uses a lot of power. There's less graphs here because it needs at least 3 gigs of RAM, which means that the 760 can't compete. 1070 Ti, most efficient, seems to be doing that in most of these tests anyway. 1050 Ti ahead of Vega this time, and we can see that the very improved Vega 64 with its overclocking and undervolting really just puts it on par with Maxwell, which is kind of disappointing. If we take a look at the power consumption over time in Far Cry 5, here's where I think it gets really interesting. If we take a look at the red, orange, and yellow charts for Vega 64 and the RX 470, we can see that there are certain parts of the benchmark that use less electricity than the others. And this is when that there's a lot of water and you're kind of going out over the lake looking at the airplane that's coming in and shooting. Not much geometry, but a lot of water. And clearly that needs a lot less electricity in this particular title on AMD cards. Whereas the NVIDIA cards basically use the same amount of electricity no matter what part of the scene they're rendering. So I thought that was interesting. We do see a little bit of a dip in 1070 Ti power consumption, but not nearly as much as with the Vega 64 card. One last thing to point out before I hit render and upload this video is that if we look at Pascal in green and Maxwell in blue compared to Polaris in yellow, we can see that the RX 470 is awfully darn close to the GTX 970. Like, scarily close. And if we skip on over to look at Vega real quick, Vega 64 overclocked and undervolted in orange as usual, and the 140 watt also overclocked and undervolted in tan. We can see that it sits somewhere between Maxwell and Pascal, depending on how much you limit the power, especially in DirectX 11. But for the most part, when it comes to video transcoding, we see that it is more efficient than lower-end Pascal, and it gets pretty close to touching the 1070 Ti when it comes to Ethereum mining and DirectX 11 when power is limited. Here's all those cards put together real quick. If you want to take a look at it, just pause the video. And if you want all of the relative power efficiencies in relation to the overclocked 1070 Ti, here's another chart that you can spend hours looking at. Unfortunately, the YouTube attention span doesn't last for hours, so it's time to conclude this video. Hopefully you enjoyed watching this video at least half as much as I enjoyed making it. If you didn't enjoy watching this video, and no one enjoys watching my videos, I guess I'll stop uploading to YouTube. But if you did like this video, make sure to give it a like, be subscribed, and leave a comment down below if you would like to see some older generations, and I'm talking like the HD 5000 series of AMD cards, and even back to the GTX 200 series. I'll benchmark it if there's an interest, because if I'm going to spend hours, I'd like just a little bit of YouTube ad revenue to compensate my time. I think that's a fair deal. Plus, you get to watch a cool video, starring yours truly, so. See you in the next video. Until then, I'm out.